Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Global Skeptics. Today, I'm joined with a very special guest, Dr. Jonathan McLatchie himself. We will be doing a discussion. Initially, it was supposed to actually be a debate, but since that didn't really work out, we scheduled an interview. So, Dr. McLatchie, why don't you introduce yourself to us, and then we'll get to questions.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me on. I'm Jonathan McLatchie. I teach biology. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Sattler College in Boston, Massachusetts, and originally from the UK. I completed my PhD at Newcastle University in England, studying biology there. And I'm also currently doing a Master of Arts program at Southern Evangelical Seminary in Biblical Studies. So that's just a little bit of introduction to my background.
All right. Wonderful. And Dr. McLatchie, you've devoted a lot of your time to what's known as apologetics, which is the defense of the Christian faith using reason. What kind of apologetics methods do you prefer and why?
Yeah, so I assume you're talking specifically about apologetic systems, like whether I'm a classical apologist or so I'm an evidentialist apologist, and very staunchly so. So I argue that that contingent beliefs, that is, beliefs that could be true or false, are best justified by evidence, by providing evidence which confirms those propositions to be true. And the way that I would define evidence, I think in Bayesian terms, so evidence for me is that which is more probable given the hypothesis in question than given the falsity of that hypothesis. So to take an illustration, if we imagine that we have a courtroom and the forensic scientist comes forward and he presents the murder weapon of, and the accused's fingerprints are actually shown to be on the handle of the murder weapon. That doesn't prove that the defendant is guilty, but it is evidence for it by virtue of the fact that his fingerprints being on the murder weapon is more probable given the hypothesis of guilt than given the falsity of that hypothesis. And I would seek to develop a cumulative argument for Christianity and for theism as well. I don't believe that Christianity or indeed theism are justified by one single spectacular piece of evidence. Rather, we have a whole meshwork of evidences that cumulatively point in the same direction, and evidences can just having a single piece of evidence that isn't sufficient on its own can be factored into a broader cumulative case, such that you have many pieces of evidence which none by themselves would be of particularly great weight, but taken together, considered holistically, they stack up to form a massive cumulative argument.
All right. So you've had dealings with celebrity type atheists in the past, and certainly there is a lot of people, irreligion seems to be on the rise. So a lot of people want to know, well, what reason is there, right, to be a theist, right? I mean, because for a lot of people, they seem to have, I suppose, a misconception that, theism is just taken on faith, and faith isn't something that can justify. So just briefly, I mean, that's probably an impossible task, but summarize what reasons do you start with for someone to be a theist? What are some reasons that you're okay, here is why, just briefly summed up.
So we're talking about theism broadly, or Christianity?
Yes.
Theism broadly. Yeah. So my own expertise is in biological sciences, so I'd probably start there. I'm talking about some of the evidence in the biological sciences, in particular the information that we find intrinsic to the hereditary molecules of DNA and RNA. In 1957, Francis Crick proposed that chemicals called bases that run along the spine or the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule function as alphabetic characters in written language or digital characters in a machine code. And when we observe digital information, especially in digital form, we routinely attribute that to rational, conscious, deliberative agency, whether it be in the paragraphs of a book or in a hieroglyphic inscription or a computer programming script, what have you. When we have these subunits or arrangement of symbols which serve some higher level objective. So we have paragraphs which convey meaning, which are comprised of sentences and individual words and individual arrangements of letters, and we know that there's some higher level purpose that those characters are performing when taken together. And that sort of phenomena is uniformly attributed to conscious activity. So when we find that sort of evidence in the cell, I would argue that the best explanation is that it too arose by virtue of an intelligent cause. I would question the ability of natural selection and random genetic mutation to explain the complexity and design that we see in biological systems. I think that, and when you look at the protein structures that we observe, for example, and you might be familiar with Doug Axe's work on protein structures, where basically, so proteins are made up of amino acids, and the sequential arrangement of those amino acids determines how a protein will collapse into its three-dimensional structure by virtue of the properties of the side chains of the amino acids, and so there's 20 different amino acids that are used in biological proteins. So if you have a sequence of 150 amino acids, and that's 20 raised to 150 power possible ways of arranging those amino acids. And the question that we can ask empirically is, out of all those combinations of amino acids, how many of them are actually functional? How many of them form stable and functional protein structures, and how many of them are gibberish? And if you look at the literature, it turns out that the evidence suggests that actually the ratio of functional to non-functional sequences is astronomically small. And then that problem is compounded when we're dealing with macromolecular machines that require not just a single protein structure to perform a function, but lots of protein structures which have to act in concert with one another, such as DNA replication or many bacterial cell division or eukaryotic cell division. There's just so many machines that require multiple proteins to work together to perform some higher level objective. And so the probability just multiply exponentially. So there's just a few examples. And then, of course, we have the physical sciences, which I'm less of an expert in, but there's the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God, which basically argues that we have various constants and conditions of our universe that appear to be finely tuned or highly optimized for permitting life, such as ourselves. And so an example would be the cosmological constant, which is the usual figure that's given in the literature is 1 in 10 to the 120th power. And there's the gravitational constant, the ratio of the strong weak nuclear force, and so forth, and the initial low entropy conditions of the universe, and so forth. And so it seems that life permitting universes are much rarer than universes that are non-conducive to life. And so I would argue that on the proposition of theism, it's not at all implausible that God would create a universe which is conducive to embodied moral agents such as ourselves. But on the falsehood of theism, I would argue that it's quite improbable, especially when you compound those probabilities together. And therefore, it is strong evidence that tends to confirm the theistic hypothesis over the non-theistic hypothesis. And of course, the two competing explanations for the fine-tuning besides design would be, or at least broad categories of explanation would be that the constants are the way they are due to, the first one would be the constants are the way they are due to physical necessity. The problem with that is that it just moves the problem of fine-tuning back a level, because if because then you could still ask, well, why is the underlying principle that causes the constants just to have to be the way they are to physical necessity? Why does that underlying physical principle determine that the constants just are just so that life can exist? So it still leaves the fine-tuning problem unexplained, I think. And then as to the other competing contender is the chance hypothesis, which is a more popular contender. And the most popular incarnation of the chance hypothesis is the multiverse scenario, which is usually combined with the anthropic principle, which says that we couldn't exist in any other possible universe because it's not conducive to life existing. And so it's not surprising that we end up in this universe. So there's an observer selection effect. And that attempts to explain away the fine-tuning evidence. And one objection, one could give several, I'll just go one quickly, is probably the most famous objection is the Boltzmann brain problem, which is so named after an Austrian physicist. And the Boltzmann brain problem is that it becomes far more probable that you would get a small patch of order where you have, say, a single brain, a single observer fluctuating into existence out of the quantum vacuum, than that you get a life that is fine-tuned so as to be conducive to complex life forms such as ourselves. And so the more probable type of observer you would be something like a Boltzmann brain rather than the universe that we find ourselves in. So there's just a few things to start that sort
Okay,
of
so that was a really comprehensive
Mhm.
summary. Let's go a little bit into the. So basically, I understand correctly. You, as a biologist, the first thing is the complexity of life, which is the design argument. So now, in the popular culture, and I'm not talking about philosophers, I'm not talking about professionals, I'm talking about popular culture. The view has been criticized by the likes of Richard Dawkins, who have posited something like, perhaps at some point this was a good explanation, but given our current understanding, it seems like purely naturalistic events can lead to appearances of complexity. And he wrote a popular level book known as The Blind Watchmaker, which is supposed to be in response to the famous formulation by William Paley. So my question is, how do you tackle that? Because I'm sure you get a lot of these sort of objections from popular speakers. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so yeah, you're absolutely right. The William Paley popularized the famous watchmaker thesis, and that is thought to have been done away with by Charles Darwin or even by David Hume as an argument for theism or for design. And Richard Dawkins, of course, claimed famously in The Blind Watchmaker that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And in other words, before Darwin came along and published The Origin of Species in 1859, it was very difficult to, with intellectual integrity, maintain an atheistic position because if you look at living organisms, they give the strong appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But then Darwin came along and proposed that actually that appearance or illusion of design could be accounted for without recourse to an actual designer. And he invoked natural selection. And he didn't know what mutations were at the time, but chance variations that occur in a population, and the organisms which are better adapted to survive in their environment tend to survive to reproductive age to produce offspring, and they pass on their genes or their alleles to the next generation. Whereas the ones that are less adapted to survival tend to perish and die off. And so you have this change in gene frequencies in the population over time, and the more successful combinations of gene variants end up becoming more dominant over time. And so you've got this selection process, and the grist for the mill of natural selection is supplied by chance genetic mutations, which Darwin didn't know about DNA or genetic mutations, but those were discovered later. And as I alluded to previously, I think that there's a number of problems with that sort of scenario. I mentioned the rarity of protein folds in combinatorial space, for example, that form stable structures that can perform a function. And I mentioned irreducibly complex machines, which have this higher level objective that's accomplished by multiple subfunctions that work together in concert with one another, as a significant challenge to the neo-Darwinian view, because in a neo-Darwinian view, you have to retain that sort of survival advantage all along the way. You can't take multiple coordinated steps towards an adaptive benefit, because natural selection is a tinkering process, and you have to you can only have small jumps between islands of function, if you will. When it comes to explaining, for example, so irreducible complexity is one system which I would argue requires some sort of foresight to bring about. Whenever you see these higher level objectives, I would argue that we need foresight to bring those about. Another example of that would be a developmental trajectory, where you go from a zygote or fertilized egg to an adult form capable of reproduction. And that happens by a process in animals of cell differentiation and subsequent specification. So the zygote will differentiate into 2 daughter cells, and that will differentiate into 4, and into 8, into 16, 32, and so forth. And at each cell division, each round of cell division, you're down-regulating certain genes, and so they're becoming increasingly adapted. But they're down-regulating genes with respect. They're making sort of commitments with respect to not what those cells are doing, but what one of their progeny is going to be doing way down the road. But that is the sort of thing that requires foresight to bring about, rather than a blind, mindless process. There's much more that could be said on that.
See. So, a little bit of a clarification also on where you stand on the intelligent design movement. Do you consider it to be pseudoscientific? Do you consider it to perhaps have some basis but not be really good, or do you stand behind it?
Yeah.
And why?
So I'm on board with the intelligent design community. I prefer not to call them a movement because that suggests some sort of political connotation. But it's an intelligent design research community, and I would have affiliation with that. I worked actually with the Discovery Institute between 2012 and 2013 in Seattle, Washington. I am more sympathetic to the proposition of common ancestry than the majority, not all, but the majority of intelligent design proponents would be. Though I have company among people like Michael Behe and Michael Denton and others who would subscribe to common ancestry. I think that you can make a decent case for that. But an important point to bear in mind is that Charles Darwin, the idea of common descent was not new with Charles Darwin, right? You can find that going back to the ancient Greeks. What was new with Darwin was the idea that natural selection could serve as a designer substitute. And demonstrating common descent doesn't get you to that conclusion. So yeah, I'm very sympathetic to the intelligent design research community.
Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about your debate, or was it debates? I can't remember, with Matt Dillahunty. You've actually, I know for a fact that you've had at least one formal debate and have called into his show at least once that I remember, probably more. I mean, I'm pretty sure you've had a lot of interactions with him. Now, I've in the past been hostile to Matt, and we haven't really gotten along, to put it mildly. But recently, I mean, I've thought out. I don't. I'm not that hostile anymore. But let's hear your side. What do you think about the objections he raises? Do you think he is misinformed, just another one of those people that doesn't understand things, or do you think that he has some serious challenges to theism?
Yeah. So I've called into the show, The Atheist Experience, 3 times in total, actually, and I've debated Matt Dillahunty once. I think Matt Dillahunty is very intelligent. I think that he probably has a very high IQ. I do not, however, think that he's well informed, and I don't think he's well read. So, and I think that a lot of the objections that he raises are very amateurish, that would be recognized by anyone that's got a basic command of epistemology. So, for example, one of his key talking points is that claims are not evidence. And this is one of the key talking points that he made in his debate with myself. And I understand what he means by that and why he's saying that. But so what he's thinking about is propositional claims rather than testimonial claims. So a proposition, of course, is not evidence. But when we're dealing with the New Testament, we're dealing not with just propositions, but with testimonial claims. And a testimonial claim is a form of evidence. So, for example, if a woman claims that she was sexually assaulted, that is evidence. It might not be conclusive evidence. It might not be sufficient to warrant belief that the accused is guilty of the crime, because people do lie sometimes. But the vast majority of cases where a man is accused of sexually assaulting women, it turns out that it's very rare for women to lie about it. It does happen, but it depending on what study you read, it's less than 10%. So it's I forget exactly, but somewhere between 3 and 8% of cases are lied about by the women. So it is a form of evidence that needs to be taken into consideration. And if you have lots of different independent witnesses testifying that this happened, then that provides even better evidence. And so if we imagine, for instance, that we have, let's say we have 500 people that testify to having observed an event, well, that most people would say that's pretty good evidence that an event like that which they describe occurred. And so it follows necessarily that one testimony is some evidence, right? And the quality of that single testimony will vary depending on contextual factors, such as how honest is this person's track, and what's their track record like? How honest is that person typically? Did they have motivation to lie about the event and things like that? Are they taking risks by coming forward? So, for example, if a woman that testifies to being sexually assaulted has much to lose by coming forward, then I would attach more weight to that testimony than someone that than say someone that has a grudge against a particular person on independent grounds that they're accusing, and so forth. So that I think is a big issue. Also, he said in his debate with me that the prior probability of the resurrection is not minimal; it's zero, and that really shows to me that he doesn't really understand Bayesian reasoning, because to demonstrate that the prior probability of a proposition is zero, you have to show that there's some logical incoherence in the proposition. So the proposition of a married bachelor, that has a prior probability of zero, because by definition, a bachelor is to be unmarried. Or the proposition of a square circle, that has a prior probability of zero. But just to posit that the prior probability of the resurrection is not minimal, is zero, it really shows that he doesn't know what he's talking about. Even, you might say that it's astronomically small, but to say that it's zero requires a demonstration of incoherence logically. I'm trying to think what else he said. It's been a while. So he, at one point he said that, so I pointed out that the fact that the disciples are willing to die as martyrs for their testimony to have witnessed the resurrected Christ, and their willingness to suffer persecution in the first century, first at the hands of the Jews and then the Romans, is evidence for their sincerity, because that willingness to suffer persecution for their claims is more probable given the hypothesis of sincerity than given the falsehood of sincerity. Dillahunty's response to that is, well, their sincerity is independent. The sincerity of the person making the claim is independent of whether the claim is actually true. And strictly speaking, that's correct, but it is evidence for the veracity of the claim, because when anyone makes any claim, we have three and only three broad categories of explanation which purport to explain that claim. One is that they got it right. One is that they lied about it. One is that they're honestly mistaken. And so by reducing significantly the probability of them deliberately lying about it, that redistributes the probabilities and increases the probability of the resurrection. So it does provide evidence that needs to be taken into consideration. So I feel like Dillahunty doesn't understand the nature of cumulative cases, and he doesn't understand that you don't have to have every single piece of evidence being sufficient to warrant the conclusion. You can make a cumulative argument based on not just one piece of evidence, but lots of pieces of evidence which cumulatively provide evidence, although might not be sufficient in themselves, but taken holistically, cumulatively, they point and provide sufficient reason to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. So if you want more on that, I've done some videos on my channel.
More importantly, let's talk a little bit more about Matt Dillahunty.
Mm-hmm.
And his response to these kind of design arguments. And he usually says that, okay, we have no way to establish that it's a design because certain things can, for example, be a beaver dam. That's the famous example he uses that has been built by beavers. And there could be some natural phenomena, such as like a storm, creating the impression of there being a beaver dam. So with no prior knowledge, you couldn't distinguish between them. And thus, it could be that we couldn't distinguish information that's there by design from information that's there through natural forces in the same way. What's your response to that?
So if I'm understanding correctly, we need to assess the prior probability of an event, right? Mm-hmm. So there could be alternative explanations that purport to explain an event. For example, if I walk into the kitchen and see that dinner is being prepared, well, I could come to the conclusion that my wife has prepared dinner for me, or I could come to the conclusion that it was prepared by pixies that just magically appeared in the kitchen and cooked dinner. Well, both of those would explain the data, but one of them has a much higher prior probability than the other, because I have independent reason to believe that my wife is real and we're married and so forth, and whereas I don't have independent reason to believe in pixies. And likewise, when it comes to, let's say, the resurrection of Jesus, well, yes, you could explain it by God raising Jesus from the dead, or perhaps you could explain it by aliens coming and using some sort of advanced technology to raise Jesus from the dead.
This sort of response for Dillahunty isn't about the resurrection, but about the fine-tuning types of arguments.
Okay. Could you explain how could you explain how he develops that
So
argument?
most often the way he formulates is that we so we, for example, perceive some things and we think they're designed, like for example DNA, as you brought up, biological mechanism. But he says we have evidence, for example, and I'm just paraphrasing, that certain things can appear designed that aren't designed. And the example he brings is something like a beaver dam. So sure, we can, for example, look at the structure and conclude it was designed by a beaver dam, but then we can find similar structures that were put there by a thunderstorm, perhaps. So that sort of thing. Why is it unlikely, one would say, that combination of chance and necessity could form something that after thousands or perhaps millions or billions of years could look designed, even though it's not strictly speaking designed?
Yeah, so for that argument to hold much weight, you would have to show that information content of the sort that we find in the cell can be explained by naturalistic processes, and that would really reduce the force of the design argument. And now Dillahunty presumably thinks that you can do that through evolution by natural selection, but that is of course the point of contention. So I would reject the ability of natural selection, random genetic mutation, to explain the information in the cell. And I would deduce scientific reasons for thinking that. So I think that probably is a technical disagreement between Dillahunty and myself at that point.
I see. Okay, so let's touch a little bit about some of the other points you've made in the past. Now, what can you tell us about your debate, I believe you had with Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor? And he seems to have a very positive conception of you in some of his videos. So how did that go?
Yeah, so I really like Cosmic Skeptic, Alex O'Connor. He's a really great guy. We've had some Skype calls since that engagement, and we had dinner before the event. So we get along quite well. And I enjoyed the engagement with him. I thought that at the time he was a little underprepared on the New Testament scholarship side of things. I thought that his objections to the New Testament were quite weak. And I pressed him on a few of those in the cross-examination, although it was too short to cover everything. But I thought that he so in his cross-examination period, as I recall, he put forward the moral objections to the Old Testament, in particular focusing on Exodus 21 and Numbers 31. Exodus 21 is a passage concerning slavery in the Old Testament, and Numbers 31 is one concerning what appears on first blush to be sexual slavery. And at the time, I actually wasn't particularly I hadn't done a lot of in-depth study on that particular text, but I think that it's a challenging text, but not perhaps not as challenging as it first appears to be. When you read, for example, in Deuteronomy, so I'll just to give the context in Numbers 31, in case listeners or viewers are not familiar. So. This is from Numbers 31, from verse 17 and following. So this is Moses' command. Actually, I'll read from verse 13. This is so Moses and Eleazar, the priest, and all the chiefs of the congregation went to meet them outside the camp. So this is the vengeance on Midian. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the commanders of thousands and the commanders of hundreds who had come from service in the war. Moses said to them, "Have you let all the women live? Behold, these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord in the incident of Peor. And so the plague came among the congregation of the Lord. Now, therefore, kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man by lying with him. But all the young girls who have not known man by lying with him, keep alive for yourselves. Encamp outside the camp 7 days. Whoever of you has killed any person, and whoever has touched any slain, purify yourselves and your captives on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. You shall purify every garment, every skin, every article of skin, all work of goat's hair, and every article of wood." So the objection that Alex brought up, and I think this is a legitimate objection to bring up, is that verse 18 in particular looks very much like they're being taken for sexual gratification, but only young girls who have not known men by lying with him keep alive for yourselves. I would go over to Deuteronomy 21 to give some context about what marrying female captives looked like. Now, I do think that I'm not saying this is not a difficult text. I think it is a difficult text, but I think that it's somewhat less difficult than at initial appearances it seems to be. So in Deuteronomy 21, it says, verse 10, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you shall bring her home to your house. She shall shave her head and pare her nails, and she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house and lament her father and her mother a full month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But if you no longer delight in her, you shall let her go where she wants, but you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. So it seems from this text that the captured females that were marrying the Israelite soldiers, they were to be treated with kindness. They were to be given a month to mourn their deceased relatives, and she is not to be treated as a slave. And if she and she's also to be set free if the husband or if the person that's captured her no longer delights in her. And furthermore, it doesn't even specify what if the woman declines to marry the Hebrew soldier. It doesn't give any indication as to what happens in that circumstance. So yeah, I think it's a difficult passage, but I don't see it as having huge evidential value in disconfirming Christianity. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I think you provided a very comprehensive summary as ever. So let's try a little bit on touching some of the other new atheist objections that have been posed in the past to you. So a little bit about something that, once again, has been posed in popular literature. Again, this doesn't go deeply. This isn't like a philosophical argument. This is more in a popular culture, but it seems to be more common. So I think variations of it are used by both Dawkins and Delahanty, and basically go something like, okay, we can have the mystery of the information contained in the life forms, but why would we want to appeal to what they call a bigger mystery? So Richard Dawkins formulates this as saying, you know what, the universe can be compared to Boeing 747, and to explain it, we're formulating even more complex plane that would need even more explanation. So what do you think is going on with that objection, and why do you think that's not a good objection?
Yeah, so when it comes to explaining, let's say, a hieroglyphic inscription or the pages of a book, then do we invoke an author, a human mind, to explain the existence of that hieroglyphic inscription or the pages, the paragraphs in the pages of the book? Well, the human mind is much more complicated than the hieroglyphic inscription, etc. So so surely that would preclude us from ever concluding intelligence is involved in explaining some sort of phenomenon. Furthermore, as Wilhelm Krug often points out, to posit an explanation as being the best explanation for a given phenomenon does not require that you have an explanation for the explanation, right? Otherwise, that would lead to an infinite regress of explanations, and you would never explain anything ultimately. And furthermore, I would argue that God is fundamentally simple, because God is not comprised of material parts. So it's very difficult to say that God is more complex than things that are comprised of material parts when God himself doesn't have material parts, right? That's the doctrine of divine simplicity. Those would be the main points that I would want to raise there.
Okay. So some of the viewers wanted to know, who is the toughest opponent you faced from the other side?
Ooh, that's a good question. Are we talking about atheists only, or also people like in Islam?
No, we're talking about atheists here.
Atheists only. I think.
You're at a loss for words.
I think maybe probably Apologia. And,
really?
Harry Amos. So I did a panel debate with myself and another Christian called Max Baker Heitch. He's a philosopher, and on the atheist side were Apologia and Harry Amos, and the topic was, did Jesus rise from the dead? And I found that to be a very rich discussion, very rich engagement. So I would highly recommend checking that out.
Wait, you actually think that Apologia is that good?
I found that he was better than most atheists I've debated on the subject of the resurrection. And it wasn't just him and me either. He was also with Harry Amos. But you're right. He does make a lot of mistakes, and he's often a little uncharitable in how he interprets things. But I thought that he wasn't too bad on the discussion on the resurrection. At least he did a lot better, I thought, than some of the other opponents I've debated.
Okay, so we need to talk about a little bit, because certain conspiracy theories seem to be making their way back into some of the popular atheist communities. One of them is this idea that Jesus never existed, the Christ myth theory. What have you got to say about that? Do you think that we can safely brush that off as another conspiracy theory, or is there something concerning?
The Christ myth theory, I think, is very difficult to defend. I've written an essay on my website where I interact in a lot of detail with Richard Carrier's book, which is On the Historicity of Jesus, who I might have reason to doubt. I've also debated Richard Carrier, and he was also a good debate opponent, though we debated on Unbelievable, so you don't have the time available to really unpack things in a lot of depth. But I've written a detailed article on that, discussing in particular his interpretation of the Pauline corpus, and I also interact with his interaction with the Book of Acts and the historicity of Acts. I find the book, frankly, to be a bit of a train wreck in terms of argument. In fact, a friend of mine who deconverted a couple of years ago was very much sold on Richard Carrier, and I actually did an interview with him on my channel recently. And he got in touch with me, and following the debate with Matt Dillahunty, because Richard Carrier on his blog had basically invited people to, or encouraged people to find someone on the other side that is informed and intelligent, and find out and enter into dialogue with them, find out why they disagree with you. And so this guy contacted me on through my website, and we sat down on Zoom and opened up Richard Carrier's material. He was a big fan of Richard Carrier at the time, but now he's completely distanced himself from Richard Carrier. So Richard Carrier's content, really, when you look up the primary sources, it falls apart, and he's actually never Christian again. I'm not a big fan of the Jesus myth theory. In fact, I think that the case from Paul is sufficient on its own. I mean, Paul knew knew Jesus' closest disciple Peter, and knew Jesus' brother James, and so he's only one person removed from the historical Jesus. We also have the Book of Acts, and which is written. I think there's a very good case to be made that Luke is indeed the author of Luke Acts, and he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul and had access to the living witnesses to Jesus' ministry and indeed his resurrection. In particular, because he mentions in Acts 21 that he was present with Paul in Jerusalem when all the elders were present, and I would argue the best interpretation of the we passages from Acts 16 onwards is indeed the most face value reading, which is that he's claiming to be a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul, and I think we can show that through historiographical evidence, both internal and external to the Book of Acts. And then of course you've got the Gospels, and I would argue that John himself is probably John the son of Zebedee. I think you can make a robust argument for that. So you've got eyewitness testimony for the life of Jesus.
All right. Okay, so I actually also want to comment that I've long said that from the popular atheist writers, speakers, and stuff, and just talking about the popular stuff, Richard Carrier would really be up there for me. I'm consistently amazed with how profound and smart the person is. I think he's nothing short of really, really intelligent and very resourceful. But we need to touch a little bit on the presuppositional apologetics, because a lot of people feel like perhaps evidentialism, one, isn't strong enough, two, compromises methods. First, how do you understand presuppositionalism? Offer a summary of how you understand it. Secondly, what do you think it's fundamentally flawed, and why?
I think it's fundamentally flawed, and I have a number of reasons for thinking that. One is that, so it obviously commits circular reasoning, I would argue. It starts with the conclusion and then tries to interpret the world in line with that conclusion. And when you press a presuppositionalist on their circular reasoning, they will basically, because they've already committed one logical fallacy, they might as well commit another. They'll commit the fallacy of equivocation, which is basically where the meaning of your terms changes midway through the argument. And so the equivocation in the case of presuppositionalists is that they equivocate between two sorts of presuppositions. There are presuppositions involving content, and there's presuppositions involving first principles. So to illustrate that, imagine the statement that all bachelors are unmarried. Well, do we have to go and start gathering evidence to confirm that that's the case? Well, no, we get to just presuppose that all bachelors are unmarried because it's an analytically true statement, right? It's true by virtue of what we mean by bachelor, what we mean by unmarried. So all you need to do to test the veracity of the statement is to analyze the constituent terms. Likewise with the statement that 2 + 2 = 4, so mathematical truths, that statement is true by virtue of what we mean by 2 + equals 4, right? And then there are also logical truths like A is not non-A at the same time in the same sense, the law of non-contradiction. Well, that is true by virtue of what we mean by A and what we mean by non-A, right? So these, I would argue, are presuppositions of first principles, which are justified presuppositions by virtue of them being analytically true statements. Whereas then consider the proposition. So we considered previously the statement all bachelors are unmarried. Now consider the proposition all bachelors are unhappy. Well, that might be true, but it also might be false. We couldn't just presuppose it. We couldn't just analyze the constituent terms to test the veracity of that statement. We'd actually have to go and start interviewing bachelors to find out whether they're happy or not. And we'd never arrive at certainty of the affirmation of that proposition because we might have missed a bachelor somewhere. So the statement that the Bible is true, I think, is more akin to that second sort of proposition, a contingent proposition that isn't just an analytically true statement. There's nothing analytically true about the statement that God has revealed himself through the Bible and in the person of Jesus Christ. So that's the first problem. The second problem is what I call the progressive revelation problem, which is imagine that you are a first century Jew living at the time when the New Testament is being written. And how would you know that the New Testament is a legitimate continuation of the Hebrew Bible? Well, you wouldn't be very convinced if someone said, well, unless you presuppose the New Testament, then nothing makes sense, right? You can't even do logic, you can't reason, you can't use argument, you can't justify mathematics and so forth. You can't justify rationality and reason because the New Testament is just being written. So that really is problematic. Did Abraham not have the foundations for reason and logic and so forth? So that's a really and it's also difficult. I never hear presuppositionalists really define what is the minimum set of conditions necessary for justifying reason in their view. So, for instance, if you were to remove the Book of Jude from the canon, would we still have the foundation for the preconditions for reason and so forth? Or if you were to remove the virgin birth, would you have? So what is the minimum set of preconditions? Finally, another point I'll make is that the presuppositionalists are often, they're very enthusiastic about revealing internal inconsistencies in other worldviews. And they are very enthusiastic about showing that Christianity uniquely, in their view, is a consistent worldview, and consistency in their views is a hallmark of truth. Whereas you can have a proposition that's coherent and yet not true. The statement that the moon is made of cheese is perfectly coherent. There's nothing incoherent about that statement. There's something internally inconsistent, but it's just false because it doesn't correspond to reality. So demonstrating that even if Christianity is the only consistent worldview, that doesn't follow that Christianity is true. There could be alternative systems, even that people haven't thought of yet, that are not only consistent but also correspond to reality. So hopefully that serves as an introduction to why I disagree with presuppositionalism.
Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay. So we have been going for about 45 minutes. We're just about ready to wrap up. So a couple of questions that I believe came from our viewers. Yeah, somebody wanted you to comment. Are you planning on calling in again to the Atheist Experience?
Did you say, am I planning to call in again to the Atheist Experience?
Yeah.
No, I'm not. I mean, I've called in 3 times. They're on my YouTube channel. At least the last 2 of them. The first one was quite a number of years ago, but the most recent 2 are on my YouTube channel, and you'll see that they didn't do very well. And when someone informed calls into the Atheist Experience, the way they typically react is to so, for example, let's say they're talking about let's say you're calling in to talk about intelligent design, which I've done before. They typically will say, well, why are you calling into an atheist show when we're not experts on this topic? But then my question is, well, why encourage Christians to call in if you're only willing to talk to people who are less expert than you are, right? So, typically, and another tactic is to hang up on people so it's also not a level playing field, because there's 2 callers. The audience can see these callers, they can't see you, so it's not a level playing field. They did on one occasion try to have a good conversation on the resurrection with me, but it did not go well. So that was one with Jenna Belk and forgetting the other guy's name who was on at the time, but Dan Baker, I think. Don Baker.
Yeah, that's the name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. I see. So a couple of others that we wanted to get to is do you think that the case for God is probabilistic, as in, do you think that God probably exists, or do you think that the case for God is more deductive in nature, where we're go ahead.
Yeah, I prefer to make inductive arguments rather than deductive arguments, for the reason that it makes the uncertainty in the premises more explicit. And so I much prefer to argue probabilistically. I wouldn't say that I'm certain that God exists, but I would say that I'm morally certain, or certain beyond a reasonable doubt, that God exists. And likewise with the resurrection, I wouldn't say that I'm certain Jesus rose from the dead or that Christianity is true, but let's just say I'm not losing sleep over whether I'm wrong.
I see. What about more traditional arguments, like cosmological arguments? Do you touch on those, or do you just leave them to the experts in philosophy?
Sorry, which arguments? Which traditional arguments?
Well, something like the cosmological argument, perhaps the Kalam or the Leibnizian cosmological argument.
The classical arguments. Yeah. So I've made the cosmological argument. I actually prefer to frame it inductively rather than deductively. There's a good paper on this actually by Callum Miller. So I'd recommend that if people want to look at how you could formulate the Kalam argument inductively. I like the Leibnizian contingency argument as well. I like the fine-tuning argument, but again, on the physical sciences, I'm not so much an expert, so I prefer to lead with arguments where I feel much more confident. So my primary arguments I would use for the existence of God would be the intelligent design argument in biology, and also the case for the resurrection, this is also one area where I disagree with classical apologists, because classical apologists argue that you need to establish the existence of God before you make the case for the resurrection, whereas I would argue that the resurrection itself can serve as evidence confirming the existence of God.
So
that's interesting. And the way that and actually I think that the classical apologists have this backwards, because so to give an analogy, and this is an analogy I draw from my friend Lydia McGrew, who's an analytic philosopher, that imagine that we have, let's take a random name, John Smith. Let's take the proposition that John Smith exists. Well, how much does that raise the prior probability that tomorrow I will receive an email from John Smith? A little bit, but not very much. But then let's suppose that we don't have independent reason to believe that John Smith exists, but tomorrow I receive an email that claims to be from someone who identifies as John Smith. Well, that now is quite strong evidence that a guy called John Smith exists. So I would argue that even if we have independent reason to believe that God exists, that only raises the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus minimally. Whereas if we have strong confirming reason to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, then that actually provides quite strong confirming evidence for theism.
I see. So, if you don't mind, and we're just about done here, to show, and I, as a classical theist myself, do believe that, well, resurrection is just a proof for Christianity after God has been established. But how would you argue that the resurrection itself provides proof for God?
Well, I would hesitate to use the word proof. I would rather use the word evidence. But
okay, evidence.
Yeah. I would argue that the resurrection of Jesus is much more probable given Christianity being true than its falsehood. And I would argue that God raising Jesus from the dead is really the best explanation for why the evidence points to Jesus rising from the dead, because the prior probability is much higher for the hypothesis that God raised Jesus from the dead than some alternative explanations, such as aliens raised Jesus using some super advanced technology. Well, we don't have any independent reason to believe the aliens exist, and also that they would have such technology, and also it's very unlikely that they would be able to travel such huge galactic distances to arrive at our planet and so forth. And it's also very, very striking coincidence that it just so happens to be Jesus who was prophesied to be raised from the dead in the Old Testament. So in Isaiah 53:10, it actually speaks about the Messiah rising from the dead, and Jesus himself over and over again predicts his resurrection from the dead. And so we have independent reason to expect the resurrection if Jesus is indeed the Messiah. So the resurrection then is much more probable given the messianic identity of Jesus and its falsehood. And so therefore it constitutes evidence of that. And because Jesus' messianic identity is tied up with the God of the Bible existing, therefore it provides very compelling confirming evidence to believe that the God of the Bible indeed exists.
All right. With that, I want to thank you so much for your appearance. I think it was really enjoyable. Hope you enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Yeah, it was really insightful. Our viewers are thankful. I'm thankful. And once again, thank you so much for dropping by and for giving us such a comprehensive case for what you argue. Guys, I put the link in the description. Check out Jonathan's other content. It's magnificent. Go out there, subscribe to his channel. Check out his stuff. He's got wonderful blog posts. With that, we say goodbye, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.